Hello and welcome to Melee's Turnwheel. This series that takes a retroactive look at the Fire Emblem series chapter by chapter. I'm your host, I'm Melee Kirby, and today we are wrapping up Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones. You might notice that I'm a little bit quieter than usual. That's because I'm recording this pretty late, very late, actually. At least this section. I'm probably going to have to do this across more than one sitting. But I wanted to start it tonight because I got a kick to sit down and record. And that was good. I wanted to capitalize on that because, well, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but the long and short of it, I'll get more into this in a minute once I get through all the questions and everything. But the long and short of it is that I've been kind of putting this one off for a little bit, and I'll explain why that is in a minute. But for right now, let's go ahead and talk about the questions from last episode, kind of. So, before we talk about the answers to the question that I just asked in the previous episode, I do have a couple of other things that I want to address. First of all, I did get an email from a person responding to the question, not last episode's question, but the question before. And this person emailed me like 2 hours before I put out the last episode. And I felt bad because they clearly put a lot of time and effort into their response. And I could have probably just like opened up Audacity real quick and rattled it off and like quickly edited it into place. But I was being really lazy that particular night. I was kind of not in editing and recording mood. And I was so close to having the episode up. So I just said, fuck it, I'm going to put the episode up. But I did still want to give that person a shout out because their response was both very thorough and very interesting. So I'm going to read it here. Again, this is one that I got via email. I love the unique classes across the series. It would be a much shorter list to talk about the ones I don't like. A few that really stand out to me are Jake being a ballistician in FE11, very fun to use, and I was very upset to see he traded it for a horse and bow in FE12. That is a bummer. I completely agree. Also, Zane from FE11 and 12. I don't use him much, but his shape-shifting power is interesting in both gameplay and in-universe, as he appears to be the only dragon that can do that. Why is that? Great question. I don't know. I mentioned before that I don't know a whole lot about Arcanea lore. So I'm hoping to gain a little bit more insight about that as I get into some of those games. But yeah, I don't. Maybe he could just do that. I don't know what type of dragon he is. Maybe there's like a specific species of dragon that can do that we don't see very many of. Pan as a Tagwell in Awakening. I love her design, and the idea of rabbit warriors is interesting. Usually in the series, if someone is some sort of animal-human hybrid, it's with something more aggressive and fantasy-based like dragons. When they did dip into real animals in the Tellius games, they're more or less lined up with how we see those animals, like with the herons being very peaceful. I don't know why they went warrior rabbit, but I love it. Yeah, it might be some sort of folklore thing. I'm not really sure. But yeah, bunny rabbits are not really the type of animal that you'd associate with like warrior clan pride, that sort of thing. But it worked out pretty well. I think the Tagwells are fairly interesting in Awakening. And then finally they said, Felicia and Jacob in the Maid Butler class from Fates. Their utility is amazing. Being able to get promoted skills onto a unit early in the game is so busted. But what first stood out to me was their combat animations. They really do fight like a butler/maid and stand out from any other class's non-crit animation. Yeah, this was one that before this person pointed it out, I was surprised. Like, I had completely forgotten about it. I didn't see it in anybody else's answers, and I didn't even think of it, which is a shame because I actually really like the Butler and Maid class too. I think it's so cool, and as a combined, it's like a utility class, but very unique in its utility, right? Where a lot of the time Fire Emblem utility is very homogenized, right? It's staves, and sometimes you can have like different types of staves. Fates, in addition to having different ways of being utility, also introduce a lot of different types of staffs, which is great. But there's also like some skills can offer utility, like, if you're in just like gameplay mechanics, like rescue botting is a thing, you can be utility in that regard. Or if you have certain skills like shelter, which is basically just rescue, in Fates, or if you have skills that provide like bonuses to certain units nearby, stuff like that. The rally skills in the 3DS games, are a form of utility, which is pretty cool. But the way that Fates introduced it, with the hidden weapons, weapon type, like the daggers and the shuriken, where they can reduce enemy defenses, I think is super cool. Because it's a type of utility that we don't see very often. We see buffing, but we don't really see nerfing very often, which I think is a neat concept that I'm glad that they dipped into. I hope that I don't remember it being a thing in Three Houses or in Engage, but I hope that they bring back the idea at some point. Okay, and then yeah, thank you for writing in. Sorry I didn't get around to reading your answer in the last episode, but I wanted to make sure that I shouted it out here. And then the only other thing that I wanted to talk about is I did get a Spotify comment, and I. So let me just read it to you, and you'll understand. You'll understand what the issue here is. Okay, so this person said, favorite Sacred Stones chapter is probably 5X. Definitely not the best chapter in the game. Probably not even a good chapter, but I really like when you're limited to a really small selection of units or troops, and you're heavily outnumbered. 4 units plus no healers feels like such a step up to earlier chapters if you're new. It also does a good job of showing Ephraim's, in multiple quotes, tactical genius, which is very funny. And I respect the hell out of this answer. I think it is, I just being fully transparent. I think I said as much in the actual episode. I don't care much for 5X. I think it's a little bit more than a little bit boring for me personally. But I'm in no position, and this is something that we're going to see in some of the later games. I'm in no position to argue about maps that a lot of people don't like, being a favorite of mine, because that's something that I there's a lot of maps in the series that feel that way. I would argue even a couple from this game. I really like chapter 21, I think it is, or no, 20. I think 20, the one with Morva. I know a lot of people really don't like that chapter, but I was a big fan of it, and I put it pretty high. I regarded it pretty highly, after I'd played through all the maps. But yeah, I think that's a really cool answer, and I respect that opinion. The issue, as you guys might know, is that I was not asking for favorite Fire Emblem 8 chapter. I did actually have to go back and re-listen to the episode because I was like, did I misspeak? Did I say chapter instead of character? But no, maybe I did at the very end. But when I gave you guys the question at the beginning of the episode, I definitely said character. I think that the 5X is a cool chapter, and I think that it's a fun answer that I respect. But that was not the question that I was asking. I appreciate your engagement though, regardless of whether this is what I'm. This is. I would actually like to see more of this, but regardless of whether this was an accident or not, I would like to see more. And maybe this was their intent. Actually, maybe I didn't even consider this possibility. But like, I would love to see you guys just like give random thoughts here and there about different things about what I'm talking about. Like, it doesn't have to just be answering the question that I give out every episode, right? It can be whatever your thoughts are on any particular game, any particular topic that you find interesting and that you want to share. I would love to hear more of your thoughts about that. And so if this, if it was Solaris who wrote in, if Solaris was intending for this to just be like a incidental, like, this isn't related to anything, but my favorite chapter in the game is 5X, then that's great. I love that, and I'm very happy that they did that. But it's also very possible that they just misheard me and thought I said chapter instead of character, which would be very funny. But either way, it's not that big of a deal. I just think it's a little funny. Okay. Yeah, so thanks to both Solaris and my email correspondent. I will now read the answers to the actual question that I asked last time, which was, who is your favorite character from FE8? And I got, I believe, 2 answers. Let me just check Twitter real quick. I don't think I got any responses on Twitter. No, I did not. So just Blue Sky here. At Drano, or it's not at Drano, but Drano says, Joshua, best combat for a sword-locked unit in GBA FE, not counting FE6 Corel or promoted Roy. Iconic GBA Myrmidon sprites, charming personality, cool hair, coolest hat in the series. And those are all really valid answers. I don't know that I agree that he is necessarily the best combat for a sword-locked unit in the GBA games. That's splitting hairs a little bit. I think it's probably Rucker. I would argue maybe even Deke. But that's, not... There's room to argue. I mean, Joshua's in an easier game, which is both a benefit and a drawback, right? Because on the one hand, it's easier to find him things to do. You don't have to worry about his stats being as good. But on the other hand, it also means that he's in a game where everybody can just stomp with hand axes and javelins. So, could go either way on that one. But I think, if you're playing FE6 hard mode, it's probably Rucker. If you're going normal mode, I think Deke might be a little bit better. But that's also not at all what that's not at all what the question was. This is irrelevant to anything. I'm sorry for nitpicking, but it just activated the neurons in my brain and activated my Fire Emblem discourse mode. But Joshua as an answer for favorite character in FE8 is very respectable and understandable. I'm honestly very disappointed in myself that I made it through the entire game talking about Joshua both at the time of his recruitment and during his SSS episode without ever mentioning his hat, because that is by far one of the most iconic things in FE8 is Joshua's hat. I'm pretty sure he has it on his Myrmidon spray. If he doesn't, then he really should. But just his portrait, he has a really cool hat. And everybody loves Joshua's hat, and that's super valid. And I respect the hell out of that. He's also just cool, I think he's a fun vibe. He's got some decent supports. He's got some decent roles in the story. And despite my personal, the things that I personally feel were some of his shortcomings in the writing department, I can't deny that he is really fucking cool, and I like him a lot. And then only other response I got over on Blue Sky was from @CodeFreak8, who says, I wonder. Now, this person has a profile picture. And I know this person. I'm friends with this person, so I know who this is. You can probably tell. It is an edit of oh, and it even says Morvium there. Okay, cool. So it's an edit of Morva. And he Morva in this image is huffing on copium. Except it is Morvium. Now. This is a very funny profile picture. What I was going to say was that I don't know if I didn't know who this person was, that I'd be able to recognize this as Morva. It's like a little bit incomprehensible to me, or I think it would be. But you could probably figure it out, especially with the copium being labeled Morvium. I think it's fair to assume that that's what it is. Anyway, Morva is a very interesting choice. I've never really fully understood why Code Freak 8 is such a big Morpha fan. I think it's one of those situations where we all just have that one character that we all, despite being not very relevant to the story, and a lot of people might consider them boring or underdeveloped. We still love them. For me, it's Holland from FE4, one of my favorite Scrimblow characters in the entire series. But Morva is also a very good pick for that. I think he has some really cool implications with his backstory. I think some of the information that we learn about him through Mur's supports is very interesting. I like the way that he stands up to either the Demon King or Leon in the last chapter of the game, or one of the last chapters of the game. And I like the impact that his death has on Mur. I think there's a lot of cool elements of Morva in the story. I wish he was able to do a little bit more. I'm sure Code Freak 8 does as well, but that's neither here nor there. Morva is a pretty cool answer to this question. And that's all I got from you guys. Now, I had a hard time with this one. And I'm going to spoil a little bit of what I'm going to be talking about later. And I'm just going to come right out and say that Fire Emblem 8 does not have a cast of characters, for the most part, that I particularly like. I don't think most of the characters are bad. I don't even think most of them are like below average. But I think that a lot of them sit in like that neutral to pretty good range for me. There are very, very few characters that I deeply care about. And in fact, as I went through the game and talked about some of the characters I really like in their dialogue and interactions in the main story, I was really disappointed to do the deep dives into their supports and realize that they don't get any more interesting in their supports. In fact, if anything, they get kind of less interesting because there's so much wasted potential here. Characters like Seth, characters like La Rochelle, who I really like. I still like them. I still like both of those characters quite a bit. But I was expecting them to, I like them so much from the main story that I was expecting them to be, some of my favorite characters in the series. Once I actually got into the nitty gritty of their supports, but once I started reading, I was like, oh no, they're all boring as hell. Outside of what they get in the main story, at least in my opinion. There were two exceptions to this. And those two were Lute and Noel. I went back and I re-listened to all the SSS episodes to really see like if there was anybody that I like really latched onto. And Lute was one of them. Lute was in the second SSS episode, and I was so happy. She was like a breath of fresh air after getting through, a full episode of characters who I didn't think were that good. And then most of the second episode were characters that I just thought were kind of like middle of the road. And then I got to Lute, and I was like, oh my god, it was so refreshing to read a character who's like funny and genuinely interesting and whose like supports could be interpreted in like a multitude of different ways, and like who felt like she had depth and layers and nuance in her interactions, right? Where you had interactions like with obviously she was like very deranged and very like very full of herself and particular about like details and stuff like that, and likes messing with people. So it was really fun to see her interact with characters like Ross and Vanessa, and she was just like, fucking around with them. But then you also had her support with Archer, which is maybe my single favorite support in the entire game. It's up there at least. It's like a top 3 support for me in this game probably, where you can see that she and Archer, like you can feel just how much they care about each other from like the little details in their interaction, right? Where Lute will say something psychotic, and Archer will just like nod his head and be like, yep. Or like, Lute having, like when she is genuinely confronted emotionally in the Archer A support, when he confesses that he loves her, and she is suddenly, out of all of her supports, this is one of the only instances, maybe the only instance, where she's on the back foot in the social dynamic, and seeing her sort of in a more defensive position socially, right? And she retreats into her talking about her books and her like knowledge and trying to relate what's going on in this social interaction to what she's comfortable with, what she knows. I think that's such a nice, cute interaction between the two of them. It's so good. And the other one, Noel, he was one that I talked about more recently, not too long ago now. And I talked at length about how I think both his Jusel support and his Natasha support are so interesting. They reveal like some really interesting philosophical questions that I think are worth discussing and worth considering. Not just most of us aren't going to be in situations where we have to decide, if we see the future and it's bad, like we don't have to decide if we're going to act on it or not. It's probably not going to happen to the average person, right? But this idea of like, in a hypothetical situation, if you could do something to help somebody, but like, doing so might like go against what you believe in, is that something that you would do? And it's a pretty like basic moral question when I put it like that, I guess. But I don't know. I think the way it was executed in the Natasha support was very good, and his sort of bond with Dusel, his I don't know what the like camaraderie, I guess maybe would be the right word. He and Dusel, kind of feeling like kindred spirits in their support, where it feels like they're two people who have already somehow made it past their expiration date and are just trying to use whatever time they've been allotted, that they have left to put things right in their own way. I just think that's such a cool dynamic that I'm a really big fan of. Both of those supports were excellent. I was very torn between which of the two I prefer. I think in the end I settled on Noel, but I could like a month from now I could feel differently. I could put Lute at number one. Could put Noel at number one. But here's the thing. I compared to other games. For the playable cast, I'm tipping my hand a little bit there, but for the playable cast, really weak showing overall, in my opinion, and even Noel and Lute, despite being my favorite of the playable cast, I still wouldn't put them as highly as my favorites from other games, right? I wouldn't put them on the same level as like Hugh or Shanam or even some of the characters that I really liked, that I loved from previous games weren't necessarily my favorites. Characters like Colin, or Ray, or like Matthew. All those guys. I feel like there was so much more to chew on with some of my favorites from the other games. Or at the very even characters like Shanam or Holland. Obviously, they don't have a lot to chew on, but I just found them very endearing and entertaining in their own ways. So I was a little bit bummed. I was really looking at this cast. I was like, no one here triggers the same feelings in me that I feel for Sarah or Lewin. That's maybe a little bit of an unfair comparison because Lewin is still probably my favorite character in the series at this point. And then Sarah is, I think, number two, pretty close behind him. It's so maybe comparing anyone to those two specifically is a little bit of a lost cause, but man, there's just a lot of really good characters in the previous games. There's at least usually two or three that I can say definitively these guys are among the greats for the whole series, for me. And I didn't feel that way in FE8 for the playable cast. But of course, this is me dancing around the fact that there is one character who is not among the playable cast, who is far and away, in my opinion, the best character in Sacred Stones, and that's Leon. It took me a little while to put two and two together on this, and consider. And that's because in my head, I guess I've always just kind of only been thinking about the playable cast, and for the most part that hasn't mattered, because there hasn't been any instances where my favorite character in any given game was not a playable character. The closest was FE5 August, who I didn't put very far below characters like Shanam and Finn. Shanam wasn't even my favorite character in Thracia. I forgot about Finn completely. But yeah, so August was pretty high up there. But Thracia also just had a really excellent showing of other characters as well. Ava was also very high up there for me in that game. And I so in my head, this question, who is your favorite character in whatever game, has always been synonymous with who is your favorite playable character. But I've never really made that distinction. And in fact, I've gone out of my way to avoid it because I want to hear from you guys. Is your favorite character, a villain or an NPC that you really like? It's not it's a lot less interesting to me to restrict your guys' options to playable characters. But I guess I just never really applied that logic inwards because I haven't had to up to this point. So for whatever reason, I guess I just explained the reason. But for a while, I was just what am I going to say for who my favorite character is? Am I going to have to qualify all that with, well, I like them, but they're not as high up as some of the other characters that I've talked about in the past. And then at whatever reason at that particular time, it just kind of clicked in my head oh yeah, Leon. I completely forgot about Leon. And Leon is, I've said this, I think I said this last episode even, is probably my favorite villain in the series. I have gone back and forth a little bit on him versus Trevant. Trevant was my favorite for a very long time. In fact, if you pressed me, I might have still said Trevant was my favorite up until this most recent replay of FE8. Because, and I do still love Trevant. I think it's pretty close. But at the end of the day, Trevant is a pretty one-dimensional villain. Even though I really like what they do with him, I think they do an excellent job of setting him up as an antagonistic force in the world, and making you feel genuinely invested in seeing him get his comeuppance. It's hard to argue with the sheer the quality of the writing that surrounds Leon, like his motivations, his interactions with Eirika and Ephraim, his doubts, his fears, his anxieties, and in the ultimate tragedy of what happens to him. And then, similarly to who I've said a couple times now, is my favorite character in the series, Leon, or Lewin. You can excuse that one. I think they're pretty similar in their names. I think, similarly to Lewin, Leon has a certain level of interpretation that you can do on his actions and his character, the things that drive his character. Because on the one hand, just looking at the text as written, taking it all at face value, he was a very kind-hearted, gentle person who saw a future that he wanted to prevent and thought the only way he could do so was with the power of the Demon King, and the Demon King corrupted him and took over his soul. And that's all there is to it, especially in Eirika mode. That's the long and short of it. But there's like little things here and there that the game adds on that do kind of open this idea in your head of like, well, he's also, he has a lot of resentment. He has a lot of unresolved tension and anxiety, and his actions were almost certain. I mean, they do more or less explicitly say this. I don't want to act like this is some sort of like deep big brain read. Like I think it's all but stated explicitly that his motivations are not entirely altruistic. Like he wants to get with Eirika. He wants to be better than Ephraim, and he sees himself as not strong enough to do those things on his own, and so. Yes, he obviously wants to help his people, but at the same time, like if he can get a little bit something out of it for himself, why not? That's kind of how it's framed in the story, and man, it's so cool. I shit a lot on the way that Eirika route handles him, and I do think, as I've said, time and time again, it is the worst of the two versions by a lot, because it's so bare bones, like you get so little to work with there. But the Ephraim route representation of Leon is out of this world good. It's so cool to see, like, to have a villain for maybe the first time in the entire series that you feel genuinely invested in, you feel respect towards, and you see him as a person first and a force in the story, an antagonistic force working against the protagonists second. I don't think that has ever been the case. The closest we've gotten, FE6 does try to make Zephiel feel like he has a little bit of a point, which I think was done more or less successfully. But he's still, he's not like, we don't really get enough of Zephiel's, we don't get to see enough of Zephiel before he's like full, kill all humans mode, to really feel invested in him as a character, in my opinion. More as like, I think Zephiel works more as an idea. And then Nurgle is just like horribly botched. I think they get the tragedy part right for Nurgle, right? Like this, broadly speaking, the concept of somebody being corrupted by darkness and, losing sight of what they care about and what they love, that is a generally sad idea, and it is handled, fairly well in that regard. But in terms of like Nurgle as an actual character, right? Like we don't get shit from him. He's so nothing. We get like a little bit of backstory. We get the very basic explanation of what his deal is from Athos, and we get the implication that like he might have been a cool guy at some point, but we don't get to see it. We don't actively, and there's like no one on the good guy team actively invested in him as a character. And I think the fact that with just a few a few like flashbacks sprinkled in here and there, they create who is by far the best, most interesting villain in the series, up to this point at the very least. And then I don't know how I'm gonna feel about later villains. I don't remember liking any of them as much as Leon and Trevant. I could be wrong. I could change my mind. We'll see. But man, it's really impressive work what they did here with Leon. And I think I've gone on for a really long time. The recording time is already at over half an hour. But I think this is going to save me some time later, when I can sort of skip over a big chunk of my sort of opinion on the game's story, because a lot of it was going to be dedicated to Leon, and I think I kind of already said my piece on him with all this. So yeah, that's about all I have to say about that. As for next episode's question, we're going to be starting FE9. So do I want to come out swinging with the big one this time around? No, I might want to save it. I might want to save it for later. No, I'll keep that one in the back pocket for when we get to like 3 houses or something. Okay, let me think here. I gotta think about this one. All right, I think I got it. Real simple one this time, because we are going to meet, in the very first episode of FE9, we're going to meet, I believe, almost all of the Grail mercenaries. We meet everybody who is a Grail mercenary at the beginning of FE9. The only one that we're missing, who will eventually become a Grail mercenary, is Mia. So I guess, and we can. She's certainly on the table as an option. So my question for next time is going to be, who is your favorite Grail mercenary? And you can include Mia if you want. When I think of Grail mercenaries, I think everybody who's playable in the first chapter of Part 3 of Radiant Dawn. Like you got your Ike, Titania, Mist, Rolf, Boyd, Oscar, Riss, Mia, Gatry, Shinon. I think that's everybody. So you got a lot of options to choose from there. Maybe I don't want to restrict your options. I was gonna say maybe Ike is too easy, so maybe scratch Ike. But I if you want to say Ike, fine. But try to, if you're willing, challenge mode, hard mode. Who's your favorite? That's not Ike, because I think Ike is going to be a lot of people's favorites. Could be wrong, but probably not. I think I don't know if you know this, guys. I think Ike is very popular. I think Ike might in fact be the single most popular Fire Emblem character. I'm pretty sure he won Choose Your Legends, right? Was it him or Lynn? I know obviously Ike won for men and Lynn won for women. I'm pretty sure Ike took it overall, which is impressive because his votes were split across 2 games. But maybe Lynn did. I don't 100% remember. Anyway, yeah, so let me know who your favorite Grail mercenary is, and that'll be a good note to start FE9 on. But for now, let's go ahead and get into the bulk of this episode, which is going to be talking about FE8, my overall thoughts on it, how it kind of left, the taste it left in my mouth at the end of the day. And I have to be honest with you guys. I mentioned earlier that I was kind of putting off recording this episode, and the reason for that is because I've been having a hard time gathering my thoughts about this game. I hope you guys, I hope this isn't the case, but I do think that it may end up being a little bit of an unfocused episode. I might end up, going all over the place. I might end up jumping around between ideas because it's been a very hard process for me trying to figure out, a succinct, focused way for me to describe my thoughts on this game. So I apologize in advance if it feels a little bit unfocused. But I really sat down and I was really trying to come up with my thoughts about this game. And at the end of the day, I find myself not having a lot of opinions on this game one way or the other. It feels so it feels like this is a very a Fire Emblem game that I just don't have a lot of thoughts on, broadly speaking, and that's weird to me because on the one hand, it's so unique in a lot of ways, right? Like it introduced a lot of mechanics that had not been a part of the series since Fire Emblem Gaiden, right? Like a lot more variety in enemies, a world map that offers a lot more freedom, and agency in how you decide to engage with the content, right? You can do side missions, you can do side battles, you can restock on supplies to reduce the tedium of having to manage your items. But if you chose not to do that, it was obviously all completely optional as well, which is great. And it struck a good balance, I think, between locking you into the next chapter if you decide to progress towards it. You couldn't back out into the world map. I thought that was an interesting choice. It has the infinite grinding. It has the world map. It has a lot of polish and a lot of ideas that feel executed on better than in the previous two GBA games. And so from that angle, it feels like I should have a lot to say about this game, right? Because it has so many elements that make you. I mean, I didn't even mention the first Fire Emblem game to have a real post game. Like that's huge. That's such a major accomplishment. Maybe a major accomplishment is the wrong term to use, but it's a standout feature that feels like it should be noteworthy. And it is, obviously, like it's worth talking about. But even in that episode where I talked about the creature campaign, I felt like I had so little to say about it because it's so underbaked. It feels like you get one extra map where you can do skirmishes that is not a part of the main story, and you can do the Tower of Volney and the Lagdao runes as many times as you want, unlock some fun characters. It's a nice little bonus mode, but it doesn't feel like anything that is like really to be held in high regard, in my opinion. It's a really basic feature that wasn't executed super well, and I'm getting into like more detail about specifically the creature campaign than I wanted to, but I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that the ideas that this game had were cool, but I don't think they were well executed enough for the most part to feel like they really make the game stand out in the way that I think they could have, which is a shame. And it's I think it's something that later games would rectify. I mean, obviously through the inclusion of entire like optional story chapters in the paralogs and guidance. Well, the previous games have had guidance chapters as well, but like things on the world map to engage with. Skirmishes can have if you look at FE2, I don't remember FE2 that well. I've only played it once. But it has like almost like RPG elements, right? Where you go into towns, explore, there's like side quests and stuff. And Shadows of Valentia like expands on that for better or for worse, right? Like I'm not saying the side quests in FE15 are particularly great, but it feels like despite this being the expansion and repeat of mechanics that have been in earlier games, or I guess just one earlier game, it feels like it's a half-baked inclusion of mechanics that already existed. I don't remember how in-depth the side stuff was in FE2, if I'm going to be completely honest, but I remember it being a little bit more meaty than it is in this game. I could be wrong about that. I don't remember, but I'm just basing it off the vibes, I guess. But anyway, and it's the ultimate thing that I'm trying to get at here is when I sat down and really thought about it, I think the biggest thing that I can say about this game is that it is maybe the most average Fire Emblem game that I have ever played. And this is very consistent with how my opinion of the game has developed over the years. I mean, obviously it was my first Fire Emblem game, which I do think might have something to do with it. The fact that this is the game I started with, it feels like its ideas were were less novel than maybe they would have been if this was like my third or fourth Fire Emblem game. But I don't. There's obviously no way for me to know that, so I can't be sure. But as I've played more games, this is really like sort of filtered its way towards the middle of the pack for me. There's a lot of Fire Emblem games that I like more than this one. There's a lot of Fire Emblem games that I like less than this one. And that's in line with pretty much how I feel about every individual aspect of this game. I feel like the overall map design is pretty good, but not great. I feel like the characters were pretty middle of the road. Not any of them were really bad, but most of them were just kind of average for me. Even, and this is something I might get a little bit of flack for, but I even think the story is pretty average, maybe even below average, to be honest, because Leon is an amazing character and an element of the story that I think is almost universally loved, including by myself. But at the end of the day, the villain is only one element of the story, right? Like, and I mean, there's a few good villains in this game, right? You have Calic and Volter, who people really like. I think people are a fan of Selena. There's a lot of cool villains in this game, but that's only one element that helps the story come together, right? The actual moment to moment conflict feels a little bit mixed, in my opinion, right? Like, it feels like we're kind of going through the motions a lot of the time. The beginning section of the story with meeting up with Ephraim is a neat idea. I think the execution, especially towards the end, with him kind of showing up Eirika and making her feel like second fiddle, was disappointing, and a bit of a bummer for that section of the story to go out on. But overall, I think it's a pretty cool conflict. But then from there, it feels very like it feels so mundane, like especially Eirika route. It's like if you're the whole idea is that we're going to like Rouston / Johanna, but it feels like we're kind of being like pushed along in this series of maps that feel like disconnected, like they're barely, like each individual chapter feels like it's barely accomplishing anything narratively. And that's, maybe that's just me. I don't want them to like rush through the story, but I feel like there's so few, like the in between chapter cutscenes usually have so little going on, that it's disappointing to me. Ephraim route is the same way. I do like some of the stuff that's going on there with Dusel a bit more, than anything on Eirika route, but other than that, I think the Selena conflict is definitely a bit forced, especially the part where Myrrh just like leaves Ephraim for some reason. That felt pretty forced. And then don't even get me started on like, if it feels like every like country in this game that isn't Grotto feels so poorly fleshed out. Even Rene. Like, I don't know anything about any of these countries. Rene, I don't understand about like, what kind of place was Rene before the war started. What was Fado like as a leader and as a father? That like never comes up. Hayden is there for like 5 seconds, and like Tana and Inez are like pretty big parts of the story, but we never get a sense of Frelia's culture or what it's the type of people that live there or what they value. Johanna, we can like kind of go off the vibes a little bit, like, oh, it's a barren country that seems to be predominantly like where the mercenaries come from. No way, it's just like Ilia, FE6 and FE7. But other than that, like we don't know anything about how Ismail ran the country. We have no idea, like, other than the fact that Johanna is like, like a crummy place. It's a desert. It seems like a lot of it is composed of desert, or comprised of desert. We don't know much about like why Calic would be so invested in getting out of Johanna. It feels like, and then Rouston, we know that they're like the keepers of the lore, which already doesn't make any sense, because we know that they learn about the lore of history and stuff in school, in like Grotto and Rene. So if they're the keepers of the ancient lore, are they, or does everybody seem to know about it overall? And this is a complaint that I've come back to a couple times now. I've been dancing around the word in this episode so far, but I think what it comes down to is just very poor world building. I don't get the sense of what these countries were like. I have absolutely no idea what their relationships were like before the war. I mean, obviously, they go on a lot about how Grotto and Rene were very close allies. It seems like Frelia and Rene were also very close because they, Tana and Eirika and Ephraim are all really good friends, and Inez as well. So we get that sense, but we have no idea what like Johanna or Rouston's relationship is to any of the other countries. Eirika doesn't even know who the Princess of Rouston is. She doesn't know like anything about like Johanna. Like no one says anything about any of these places, right? There's no like cutscenes where someone, Seth is like, oh, Johanna is known for, and like obviously this could be bad, if it's handled poorly, right? It could just be shitty exposition dumping if you don't do it well. But I feel like there's just so little to chew on in this world. I don't feel like Magvale is a very interesting place. The closest we get to any meaningful backstory is the stuff. I mean, the stuff at the beginning of the game with the Demon King and like the old heroes and stuff like that, which is not even like a fraction of as interesting as the Scouring. Within the first like 2 minutes, like booting up the game and letting the opening cutscene play, I feel like I already know and care more about the Scouring and the relationships between the dragons and the humans in the Lieb than I ever did about anything going on with Magvel's backstory. And then there's the stuff in the Eirika Sala support with like the Falchion kind of thing. There's a little bit going on with like the place that Sala is from more broadly. Like they seem to have a good understanding of like the world's relationship with dragons. But my question is like, why? What happened to the Manicheets that they're like no longer around anymore? All this stuff is just completely unanswered and not even really hinted at that much. There's Draco zombies in Endgame that aren't Morva. So were they previous Manicheets that had died at some point? I don't know. It's just like there's so much that goes unanswered, and it's fine to not have every single little detail fleshed out and elaborated on. But if you're gonna do that, then you need to give me something, right? You need to give me like a starting off point to like get me thinking or invested in the world in some way, even if you don't want to get into detail about it, because otherwise I'm just gonna like not care about anything, and that's what ended up happening. I don't care about a single other place or a single other character in this game that's not playable, and even then I didn't care about the playable cast that much, or like exactly Leon and maybe Calic and Volter. That's it. While we're on the subject of the story and the writing, I never ended up doing an SSS episode for Eirika or Ephraim. Frankly, and this is like going to be really just a case by case thing every time I get to the end of a game. Like, what am I going to do about the Lord? And I don't want to commit to one way or the other. I think doing an episode for the Lords in FE7 made sense for the FE7 Lords. I think just talking about Roy in the wrap up episode made sense for Roy. And I'm just going to I'm just going to do whatever feels right to me for whatever Lord, whatever the Lord in question is, or whatever the Lords in question are. And in this case, I read through the Eirika and Ephraim supports again, and I didn't have much to say. The only one that we haven't already looked at from one person's perspective at least was obviously the support that Eirika and Ephraim have with each other, which I quite like actually. I thought it was a nice support that helped establish their bond as siblings very well. They talk a little bit about how important they are to each other, just like as twins. They're even closer than normal siblings. As twins. And I made jokes in a previous episode about the slightly uncomfortable number of people who ship Eirika and Ephraim, and I don't think there's, as I said, I don't think there's anything textual to base that off of. I think it's very much a stretch, especially compared to like, this has to be said, right? Because in previous games there's been some very 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 explicit or heavily implied incest shit going on in this series. You have like obviously FE4 has like a ton of it, but then there's also like fucking Priscilla and Raven are like crazy with that. Oh my god. So it's definitely not as bad as that. I will say that they probably could have worded some things better, and if you didn't have to make the weird incest shippers job as easy as they made it, in my opinion. But that's neither here nor there. Great support between the two of them though, and I like most of their supports from the other, most of the supports they have with other characters. I think for the most part they're kind of dull. I don't think Eirika or Ephraim are particularly interesting characters in their supports. I think there's some fun stuff with Ephraim and like the Kyle support that I liked. I think Eirika has some good supports with like I think she's very kind-hearted in like the Sala support, and the Seth support. So there's a little bit to chew on there. I didn't find myself having a lot to say other than the Eirika and Ephraim support. I sat down, I read all of them, and I was just like, I could sum up my thoughts on most of these in like 2 seconds. But of course, the main appeal and the main like meat on the bones of both of these characters comes from the main story, and I have a lot of thoughts about how FE8 handles its 2 main characters, and they're mostly positive, I think. Maybe it's like half and half. We'll start with Eirika, I guess. She's the first protagonist of the story, and I think the game starts off with her on a good note. I think the way that it handles her objections and her aversion to violence is pretty interesting. A little bit generic for sure, but we haven't really had like a truly pacifistic Fire Emblem protagonist at this point, right? Like Sigurd and Seliph certainly were no pacifists. Roy was still young. I don't know if he even really like worked that out about himself yet. Leaf, I skipped over Leaf. Eliwood and Lynn. I mean, Lynn was not a pacifist. Let me tell you that. When she wanted to break the bandits' blades beneath her, like twigs beneath the stallion's hooves, I think was the line from Lynn mode that went fucking crazy for no reason. So yeah, none of those characters really feel like. I mean, the first thing we see Hector do in Eliwood mode is kill a guy. So I think from the perspective of, looking at stories more broadly, I could see why Eirika might come across as generic. But for the, the state of Fire Emblem at the time, right? Like it's a pretty interesting perspective, and I think if you really wanted to stretch, you could read into the world building from that perspective that Eirika has, right? If we're to believe, as seems to be the case, maybe that most people in the world of Magvel haven't had to do any fighting for a very, very long time. No, like, real fighting, right? Like, other than maybe against, like, bandits and stuff. Maybe the occasional monster if you live near Darkling Woods. It seems like international conflict has been very limited. Except that's not true because fucking the supports contradict that all the time. They talk about being mercenaries and, like, mercenaries hired for, like other countries to fight each other. We just, like... but Rene, for the most part, it seems like, they have an ally to the north, they have an ally to the south. They haven't had to, it seems like maybe Rene hasn't had to do any major fighting for a very long time. We can maybe interpret that from what the story implies. And so if you take that at face value, then it makes sense for Eirika to be someone who, truly does believe that most conflicts can be solved with words instead of violence, especially being such close friends with Leon, and seeing how, how invested he is in being a leader who shows that kind of compassion. That probably reinforced that idea consistently throughout her life growing up. And for her, I think it could have been so interesting to see her develop that perspective more over the course of the game. And coming to some conclusion, whether that's, maybe sometimes you do need to utilize violence in order to maintain peace, or if she wants to maintain, that true pacifism should always be the primary goal. Even if sometimes it's not always attainable. I think that either way that could have been interesting. Instead, the story does fucking nothing with her. And after the route split, even in Eirika mode, she just does absolutely nothing. She gets carted from place to place, and gets, exposition dumped on her, in like Sala's village, and she gets to, see stuff happening around her and having absolutely no opinion on it whatsoever. Other than maybe the occasional, oh man, I hate fighting Grotto, or I hope Leon's okay, occasional little trite nonsense like that. And it just doesn't go anywhere. Her interactions with Leon after the routes, the route split reconverges, in Eirika mode, she's the one who gets the primary interactions with Leon, and she has some cool moments there, but the story stops being about her values and her beliefs and starts being about her relationship with Leon, which is fine. Like, it's her relationship with Leon is cool, and I think it's very, it's interesting to see that play out on screen, but it feels like it completely drops the concept it had for her at the beginning of the game, and it doesn't really replace that with anything, because she doesn't have anything meaningful or interesting to say about Leon, and his sort of descent into darkness, right? Like, she doesn't have any, other than wanting to save Leon, right? She doesn't have any opinion on, like, the moral or philosophical implications of what's going on. It doesn't feel like she's reacting to anything that's happening other than, being sad that Leon's, in danger. And I mean, like, I've written off a lot of elements of this story and this game's writing that I don't like as being vaguely misogynistic. I'm not going to do that here, because I think it would be very easy for me to argue that Eirika, her sole focus from, the 2/3 mark on being on, her male, like, semi-love interest kind of, at least he feels that way about her. It'd be very easy for me to read that as more sort of casual misogyny. I think that would be disingenuous. I don't really think that's what's going on here. I think, it just, they kind of drop her character arc because they don't know, or they're not interested in how to develop it. I'm not sure which. And then they just don't fill in the blank with anything there. The reason I don't think it's that particular aspect of it is an aspect of misogyny, is because I think a similar thing happens with Ephraim. And Ephraim, honestly, in some ways is even worse, because I don't really feel like Ephraim has like a little bit of a plot going on. Again, though, it's super all over the place. At first it feels like, he's in this position of leadership where he's like fighting using guerrilla tactics. And I think, I don't know what the message you're supposed to glean from his interactions in 5X and in chapter like 7 and 8. I don't know what we're supposed to take away from that. If it's just that Ephraim is the coolest, most awesome guy ever, which I think is probably the most likely answer, then that's boring and I don't like it. But if I'm reading it a little bit more generously, and the idea is that, this is a self-destructive mindset, and a set of tactics that are going to get him killed or seriously hurt, or something bad's going to happen to him. First of all, they do no work establishing that at all. I have to basically read that from almost nothing. But, if that is what it's going for, then it goes basically nowhere. There's a little bit of a thread that I think you could connect between him being reckless at the beginning of the game, then the middle portion of the game, him learning that he can't be reckless anymore, because he has to, he's going to be the king of Rene. He needs to lead people. He has like that back and forth with Seth like 3 times over like whether it's okay to like have feelings, which feels a bit forced and not like, it doesn't feel like a natural progression of that same idea, because it's not about him being reckless anymore at that point. It's about him like having, balancing compassion with responsibility, which feels like a completely different idea and a completely different conflict that could also be interesting, but still doesn't go anywhere, because everything works out for him fine in the end anyway. He never has to make a decision between what's right and doing what he wants to do, right? Like he trusts Dusel, and that works out fine. He goes after Myrrh when she disappears, and that works out fine. Like there's the worst you can say, like there's an element here of like he wants to believe that Leon is still good, and Seth's like, you can't guarantee that, he might be against us, and then that ends up being true. He is against them, but then Ephraim doesn't have a moment like Eirika where he wants to trust Leon and decides to trust Leon, and that backfires. It's just like it feels like it's trying to, I don't know what it's trying to do. Like, is it trying to set up like an arc for him? Because if it is, then it doesn't even get halfway there. I don't maybe barely gets a quarter of the way there. And then after the route split, it's basically nothing. Like his interaction with Leon in chapter 18 is like about as interesting as Eirika's, in my opinion. I think especially if we read him as being just as emotionally driven and just as stupid as Eirika in that moment, which I think is a very easy read to make, then I think that it's a cool parallel between them and how they both tackle the problem incorrectly, but in different ways of being incorrect, right? With Eirika being, a little bit too willing to trust, and hope that she can resolve things just by talking it out, and Ephraim being too reckless. Those both feel like natural progressions on the ideas that are set up for them earlier in the story, but then just when you think it might be doing something, there's no lesson to be learned, there's no reflection, there's no like concept of what should come next for them as people, because it focuses entirely on Leon, and the sense of loss that they feel of basically having to accept that their best friend is gone forever. And I what's there is good, in regards to Leon, but it comes at the expense of, and I say expensive, but I really think they could have just done both and they didn't for whatever reason. But I'll say at the expense of their own character development. And I think for that reason, these are like, I like them. I like their personalities. I think they're very likable characters. I think they both have fun moments, both in the main story and in the supports. But I think in terms of like how fleshed out they are, I think these are maybe the 2 least interesting lords in the series for me. So far, I should make that very clear. We haven't seen the depths that this series can sink with its main characters, right? There's obviously like Corrin. But even, if we don't want to go that low, there's plenty of main characters that I like in the series less than Eirika and Ephraim. I would still consider them to be like, pretty good above average characters. But considering the competition that they have here, right? Like Eliwood and Hector, Seliph and Sigurd and Leif are all amazing characters, and then even some of the ones that I care a little bit less about, in Roy and Lynn, I think still have clear, defined arcs over the course of their games that feel like they were set up, built on, and then they reach the end of the game with some level of finality to that idea. Lynn maybe less so, but Lynn has the benefit of having an entire story mode dedicated to her, which feels like it should have been like the equivalent of that in FE8 is like Eirika, the beginning chapters where it's just Eirika and no Ephraim yet, but it's not like, I don't feel like they accomplish as much with Eirika in that time as they do with Lynn in the chapters dedicated to her. So I don't know. It's a little bit of a bold claim. I know both characters are very well regarded, especially Ephraim. And I will say, partially for the reasons that I've already outlined, and then partially for the fact that I think the game doesn't like women. I'm throwing that around a lot. I don't think it's as bad as I'm probably making it sound, but they definitely they like to shove Eirika to the side, to give Ephraim cool moments, in my opinion, right? And I think for both of these reasons combined, Ephraim, my opinion on Ephraim has gone way down. I used to actually think that Ephraim was one of the better lords in the series, just because, the moments where they're like, hey, Ephraim is the coolest, most awesome guy ever, that landed for me because, fuck it, man, Ephraim's really cool. Even I can't deny that. He says I don't pick fights I can't win, and runs into Renval and beats the shit out of everybody with 4 guys, and then leaves and gets away. Like, that's cool. That's hella cool. But, outside of that, I don't really think he has that much going for him. I'm just going to be honest with you guys. And I do want to reemphasize that, like my opinion on the game overall, it is mostly positive, and it is, my opinions on the Lords are also mostly positive. And I feel like I've been overly negative in a lot of ways. Both, in regards to just not even just this episode, but also in regards to like certain supports, certain characters, certain plot details, right? Like that I've talked about in previous episodes. I feel like I've been very negative on a lot of things, and I think the best way I can describe, why that's happening is because I want to justify why this game, despite being one of the most beloved games in the series, I think, it just didn't land for me in the same way that it lands for a lot of other people. Despite being my first game, I have a lot of nostalgia for it. I have a lot of reasons why it's close to my heart. I have a lot of affection for certain characters and certain certain aspects of the story. The music, oh my god! I said I was gonna mention this in the wrap up episode, and then almost completely forgot. Fuck everything I've said about the game so far. The soundtrack is one of the best in the entire series. I already mentioned how much I like Leon's theme. I think the Leon battle theme is also really good. A lot of the cutscene themes feel like appropriately, they set the mood so well. The map themes are super awesome. I'm a particularly big fan of Eirika's. Eirika, her route, like chapter 9 through chapter 14 or whatever it is. Her theme, I think Rise Above is what it's called, that fits that tone of that part of the story so well. And man, it's just like I could go on and on about all the songs I like in this game. I could list every individual example, but it would be a little bit of a fruitless endeavor, I think, because you could listen to me talk about the soundtrack, or you could just go to www.youtube.com and listen to the entire soundtrack yourself and think about it yourself and form your own opinions. I think you should do that instead. But yeah, I mean, I don't really have a whole lot else to say about the game, because I think I've exhausted just about everything I have. I think Leon's really cool. I think it has some like really good story beats, even if I think the overarching story is a little bit lackluster. And it's not one of my favorite games. It's not one of my least favorite games. It is really, at the end of the day, a game that I feel pretty neutrally on, or again, mostly positive, I would say, not neutrally. I think it's a game. I'm sorry. I kind of lost track of what I was saying there for a second. This is what I was worried about, it being a little bit unfocused, because I feel like I'm repeating myself. But the in terms of my my overall rankings of Fire Emblem games, which I'm not going to get into right now, just because it by the time the podcast is over, it may be completely different. But one thing that has stayed very consistent, actually, is that this is my pretty much smack dab in the middle for me. Maybe like give or take a couple places, but almost smack dab in the middle of the Fire Emblem series, and is also, at least currently, smack dab in the middle of the GBA games for me. I like FE6 more. I like FE7 less, I think. because I go back and forth on the GBA games a lot. Sometimes 6 is my favorite, sometimes 7 is my favorite, sometimes it's 8. Those three are all very like neck and neck for me. But the way that I feel about the games right now is that 7 is at the bottom for GBA, and then 8, and then 6. That's kind of where I'm at currently. And I think, I don't want to spend too long on this, especially since the episode is already going to be over an hour long. But I do want to briefly do a little bit of what I did at the end of FE5, and talk about how, because this really does mark the end of an era for the series, right? Like, similarly to the Kaga era of games, if you want to lump all of the Kaga games together, which I think even that might be a little bit because Kaga's games were also different from each other, whereas the GBA games have a sense of uniformity to them and a sense of identity that is so distinct from everything else in the series, that I think it bears a little bit of reflection as we come to the end of it, as like, what made the GBA games stand out among the rest of the series, what was newly introduced, what stuck around that maybe shouldn't have, what has been ditched that maybe should have stayed. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. The GBA era of Fire Emblem games is arguably the most beloved, if that's the right word, because I feel like, and this is just going anecdotally, I guess, but I feel like, not everybody has a GBA game as their favorite in the series. But I think most people have one pretty high up there. And more to the point, I guess, I can't think of a single person that I know that I've ever talked to or that I've ever seen, post stuff on the internet, who hates all three games, because there's some people out there who hate both DS games, or who hate all the 3DS games, or who hate maybe not necessarily all the Switch games. Both the Switch games. But there's, a certain subset of people who really have a strong disdain for, everything about a particular era of the series. And I don't really feel that way for GBA. I don't notice that same trend for the GBA games, and I think that it's because, despite having the same overall approach, the same overall formula to the game design, the basic UI elements, and game mechanics and things like that, I think that the fundamental design of each game is very different, and it feels like there's a little bit of something for everybody. I've talked before about how I think that every game has like different pros and cons. I think, very, very broadly speaking, for me personally, I would argue that 6 has the best gameplay, 7 has the best cast of characters, and 8 has the best cast of... I used to say 8 has the best story, but I think reflecting on it more, 8 has the best villains, probably would be a better way of putting it. I don't really know which one I would say has the best story outside of the villains. It might still be 8, just because the villains are an important part of the story. They're just not the only thing that matters, in my opinion. But it might be 7, I guess. I don't think any of them have like a super strong story, to be honest. But 7 probably has one of the more interesting ones, even though it's outright nonsensical at times. But I think what works so well about the approach, and I don't think this was done intentionally, obviously. I think that, different teams, I don't know if it was different teams or the same team, just kind of like taking a different approach with all three games, but creating such distinct experiences that feel so separate from each other, despite feeling, if you showed a layperson, 7 versus 8, they might not even be able to tell the difference, really. Like, they're that similar in their presentation, and in their fundamentals. And I think that sense of familiarity is what makes it so easy to hop from one to the other. Despite being 6 so much harder than 7, and especially 8, if one person who's played 8 could probably hop right into 6 and mostly be fine, right? Because they don't need to be taught very much. The basics are so similar and so simple, right? Because it's Fire Emblem as a concept without so many of the bells and whistles attached. 8 has some, 7 has some. There's still like a little bit that's still there. There's still a little bit of a learning curve. But you don't have anything like, Tellius bonus experience or, anything like what's going on in Radiant Dawn. You don't have the difficulty and the difficulty modes and the way that the DS games design difficulty. You don't have anything like the marriage stuff from the 3DS games. And I mean, that's not, I say 3DS, not counting SOV. And I mean, like, people aren't stupid for the most part, right? Like, they were, like, a bunch of people hopped on with Awakening and was able to just figure it out, right? Like, so it's not like, the complexity of the more modern games turned people off, or turned people away from the series. But I think there's something to be said for how approachable. Like, I think you could hand one of the GBA games to just about anybody, and they'd be able to figure it out pretty quickly. I would argue. So, there's just some beautiful simplicity to it all, that I think really defines this era of the series, and I think a lot of people really like about it, myself included. Now, there are a couple of things about this era of the series that have since been left behind, and I think, for better or for worse. I think that overall the series has gotten a lot more difficult on average. 6 is fairly challenging. I don't think it's one of the hardest games in the series, but I think it's probably the biggest hurdle for a player that's new to the series. I think that it is probably the stepping stone from the easier games to the more difficult ones. If that makes sense, right? Like, it's the sort of the gatekeeper, I guess. But even that, the line is starting to be blurred by that, in the more modern games, where I think Engage is fairly challenging. I think Three Houses on Maddening mode is pretty difficult. Certainly Conquest is an example of a harder game. So even then, right, like, that's not... but like, in the difficulty modes, like, make it harder to distinguish between, the quote-unquote designated easy games versus the hard games, because they've actually just, like, gotten better at designing difficulty modes and making, some games easy on easy mode and some games hard on hard mode. Prior to that, it was either just, like, they were all completely easy, or, even on normal mode, some of the games can be pretty difficult. But nowadays, it's a little bit, of a blurrier line, I suppose. They've started structuring the support system better. This one took them another game to figure out. But even in Path of Radiance, there's a big improvement on the support system, which is that they don't need to stand next to each other anymore. They can just be deployed in the same map, and they'll earn support points together. That also gives you very strict control over when certain characters will, or stricter control, I guess, between when certain characters will see... you'll be able to see the supports between certain characters, I should say. There's a hard minimum number of chapters that they'll have to go through before they get to certain support conversations, which gives you a little bit more flexibility in the rating. They use that to really good effect in, I believe, the... actually, I don't know. Some of them might just be, like, hard-coded to not be available until later. But it's definitely, I think it's something I can't think of any specific examples. I don't remember the Mist Jill one. I think the Mist Jill one. No, that can't be right, because you need to be able to get A in that one. Maybe it's like, I don't remember. Either way, it's a cool idea that I think they've actually mostly moved away from in the later games now, because it's back to being able to just grind them out and see them as early as possible. So that's a shame. But the fundamental idea of you're still only able to get 5 support conversations total in FE9 is my point, which is annoying. It would take them another couple of games to figure that one out. But nowadays you can get as many supports as you want, which is a huge improvement. That's been true as early as I guess technically FE12. it's weird because most characters don't even have more than 5 supports. I guess most characters have like 3, and then there's a few characters that have like 6. And then very, very few characters have more than that. So, it's not applicable in most circumstances, but it is technically true that you can get more than 5 in FE12, I think. I'm not actually 100% sure of that, but I'm pretty sure. So there's definitely been some major improvements made on these games since the GBA era, and this is by no means me trying to say that the GBA era is the best, and that it's never been surpassed in any way. That's not true. But I do think that there's, again, something to be said for just Fire Emblem in its pure distilled form, which is kind of even that description is pretty arbitrary, because what is the essence of Fire Emblem? I guess really, like, that's up for individual individual players to decide, I suppose. Maybe you think that the essence of Fire Emblem does boil down to, or at the very least includes in some way, being able to match people with each other, or at the very least, like, see more support conversations. Maybe you think that, like, access to a hub world or an overworld is in some way related to the essence of Fire Emblem, right? Like, but I think Fire Emblem in its fundamentals really does it like the GBA polishes that formula to perfection without overcomplicating it. Well, near perfection. I think even from the gameplay department, none of the games are perfect. But you guys know what I mean. They're very impressive for what they are. There's also one element of the GBA era games that I really miss and that I wish would come back in newer games that just hasn't. And that is the Trinity of Magic as we see it in the GBA games. The Trinity of Magic does exist before the GBA era games, and it does exist in a couple of games after, I think, just the Tellius games, if I'm not mistaken. But all of them involve, anima magic being split into Thunder, Fire, Wind, which is not as interesting to me as Light, Dark, and Anima more broadly. And that mechanic does exist in Yggdrasil, if I'm not mistaken, both FE4, at least FE4, maybe FE5 as well. But in that game and in pretty much every game after GBA, light magic is barely a standalone concept anymore. This is something that came up a couple episodes ago, maybe even last episode, where someone mentioned that one of their rarest, or one of their favorite rare classes was just light mage, like monk, as a standalone light magic user, because that's not something you really see anymore. It's clerics get access to light magic, kind of. The way light magic works is kind of like different from game to game now. But there's very little exploration of light magic as a concept, and to a certain extent I get it, right? Because light magic, even in this game, is a little bit on the useless side. It's just worse than anima magic, first of all, and it has like a little bit of extra crit, but usually you could just replicate that with thunder, which is going to be better in most circumstances anyway. And if you're a sage, and you go from mage to sage, light magic does basically nothing for you. The only way the light magic is really useful in this game is if you're a bishop, and then having the combat against monsters can be really good. But that's about it. So I don't necessarily think that it could be seen as fat to be trimmed off, in a similar way to how GBA did that to a lot of mechanics. But it's something cozy about it, something about having, being able to choose between, elemental magic, light magic, or dark magic is just it's just a cool aesthetic to me. And I wish that it was more prevalent. Dark magic isn't really a thing anymore either. Pretty minimally. There are dark magic spells even as recently as I don't remember about Engage, but in Three Houses, certain characters would gain access to dark magic spells, but they're not necessarily their own standalone thing. People get them as part of their spell lists regardless of what class they're in. Um, I guess that's true about all magic, but it's not really like they're considered under the same category as like fire, thunder, Fimbulvetter, all that stuff. So it's just less interesting to me as a concept. So I really hope that they utilize if they ever make a GBA remake, that would be really cool to see. I guess FE6 didn't have standalone light magic unless you promoted one of the bishops or you used Yoder. So even in the GBA games, it wasn't a perfect system by any means, but I still think that it was cool. Okay. Oh, Jesus. Okay, sorry. I had to stretch. If you can't tell, I don't know how I'm gonna sound, compared to earlier, but I did this whole GBA era segment the next day compared to when I was recording last night. So my throat's a little bit froggy. I just woke up. Not that recently. It was like an hour ago. But it's a new day. I'm feeling good. I'm gonna go to work in a few minutes. But I wanted to get this out, and I don't know if I'm probably not gonna be able to record and edit it until edit and upload it until tonight. But hopefully I'll get this out soon. I feel like for an episode that I was a little bit unsure of how to go about, I think that it came together fairly well. And I'm pretty happy with a lot of the things that I said, and the ideas that I was able to convey here, because I think that FE8 is such a weird game for me. Being my first game, and being such a beloved game by the fan base. I feel it felt weird for me to be so neutral on it, but I think I did a good job conveying why FE8 as a game doesn't really stand out to me compared to a lot of the others. So yeah, I hope that I was able to get those ideas across. And I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts. As I mentioned at the beginning there, that you guys don't have to have a response to the question of the episode to have a reason to write in and say something. I'm always interested to hear your guys' thoughts on whatever it is I'm talking about. So definitely, if you have differing opinions on FE8, things that stand out about the game more to you than they did for me, I want to hear about it. Definitely let me know at I'm Melee Kirby, Blue Sky and Twitter, email turnwheelpodcast@gmail.com, or leave a comment on Spotify or YouTube, and I'd be happy to read it. Okay, I think that's all from me. Next time we're going to be doing FE9. We're starting Tellius. I'm very excited about that. I'm hoping to get started on that soon. I am going to be playing on physical hardware, and because of that, I'm no longer going to have access to speed up. I think every single game from now on, other than maybe FE11, will be on physical hardware. I don't own FE11 physically, but I'm kind of interested in just buying a copy, because it would be cool to have parity with all the other games. I do have a flash cart of FE12 with a translation patch on it, so I will be able to play 12 physically, weirdly enough, but not 11, which is kind of weird. But it is what it is. So the point I'm trying to make here is that because I don't have speed up, it might take me longer to get through chapters, and therefore might take me longer to get episodes out. I'm not 100% sure. I think that's definitely going to be true in Radiant Dawn. Path of Radiance, I am a little bit less sure about. So I guess we'll see. And then for the first episode of FE9, we will be doing prologue, obviously, and then chapters 1, 2, and 3. So that gets us right up to I believe chapter 3. Yeah, I believe chapter 3 is when they meet Alencia for the first time, if I'm not mistaken. So if you're playing along, I don't know if anybody plays along with me, but if you do, get up to meeting Alencia and rescuing her on that chapter where you fight the Armor Knight boss. Yeah, and I'll see you guys. Yeah, I think that's it. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.